I want to start by talking about intent and following Dan North's example earlier today of starting his presentation with a well-dressed 19th century person. I'd like to introduce you to Helmut von Moltke. Moltke was a Prussian general. He lived 1800 to 1891. He was actually incredibly instrumental in the formation of a whole lot of modern military doctrine. He wrote a book called Instructions for Large Unit Commanders. And Moltke realized at some point that as armies got bigger, you couldn't actually move like a whole army at once. You had to actually split it up. And once you split it up, you lost the ability to know what every part of your army is doing. And so you couldn't count on perfect transparency and perfect obedience to actually have your armies be successful. So Moltke came up with the idea of basically mission-type tactics, which involved him not telling his commanders what he wanted them to do, but rather what the outcomes that he was looking for were. So this actually looked like, here's what I'm hoping that you'll get done. You need to be at that place by that time. Here are some general guidelines, but then the rest of the execution was up to those commanders. And he took that to a pretty serious extreme. So, as far as he was concerned, it was perfectly okay for his officers to actually disobey orders as long as they did that in pursuit of that mission. This is a pretty important concept in modern military doctrine. In fact, the US Field Operations Manual from 2008 defines this as the commander's intent succinctly describes what constitutes success for the operation. It includes the operation's purpose and the conditions that define the end state. This is Field Manual 3.0 from 2008. And again, the whole idea is that you can't actually know what everybody else is dealing with. Everybody's going to have their own localized view of the situation, and you want them to take advantage of that to optimize their actions to pursue a common goal. This is basically how to not micromanage people, which is why it's highly relevant for large corporations as well. And I want to talk about what micromanagement sort of can look like in a large corporation and talk about how it shouldn't end up looking like. And for that, I want to talk about the idea of spheres of autonomy. The concept of a sphere of autonomy is that basically everybody in your organization has some set of decisions that they theoretically are accountable for. A given engineer is given the task to write some code, and they'll figure out how to write that code. They may have the freedom to decide whether to use, for example, spaces or tabs if they're wrong, and then they can basically, execute on that. So there's this, sphere of autonomy for this individual contributor. And then this, in a classic organization, this IC is working for a manager whose sphere of autonomy is somewhat larger than theirs and completely overlaps them because, of course, if you work for somebody, they can just tell you to do anything you do differently. And then the manager has a director who has a slightly larger sphere of autonomy and who can override all of their decisions, which is why it's good to be the director, except of course that the VP is there to micromanage the director. I'm worried by some chuckles in the room. And this goes all the way up to the CEO, who can theoretically tell the IC to use spaces, which, even though it is the right answer, Python developer, by the way, is still the wrong way to do things. So this is not the way to do things, I would argue. A better approach is one where everyone has their own sphere of autonomy, and while they touch, they don't overlap. This theoretically means that the CEO actually has about the same number of different decisions they might make, and it's clear that those decisions might be more critical to the health and prosperity of the company, but the CEO doesn't get to tell the IC what to do. The manager doesn't get to tell the IC what to do. Everybody has their own sphere of autonomy. This works reasonably well. It means that everybody gets to focus on sort of like the area where they get the best visibility, and there's really like no bad news, except that like this is kind of hard. And it's hard for a variety of reasons. One is that you actually have to know, and that means sometimes negotiate, what the edges of your sphere of autonomy are. Is this my decision? Is this your decision? The other one is that you actually have to respect others' sphere of autonomy. And this is particularly relevant to an Israeli audience. When I started talking about doing this presentation with Kfir, where's Kfir? Oh, hey. I was talking about insubordination and like the idea of like, people actually speaking up more, and he was like, what if I have like way too much of that? And seriously, I said, yeah, you work with a bunch of Israelis. This model doesn't just mean that the people above you don't get to tell you what to do. This model is bidirectional. And that means that if I'm in this model, one of the things that I need to do is actually respect my boss's sphere of autonomy. And we can always disagree on stuff, we can always discuss stuff, but fundamentally, in this model, we respect the sphere of autonomy for the people below us exactly as much as we respect the sphere of autonomy for the people above us. It also means that we enforce boundaries, which may sound mostly like telling the people above us to, get out of our business. I actually generally find, mostly because for the last few bosses I've had, they've all been extremely, respectful of this, that where I end up having to enforce the sphere of autonomy is actually down, where I have people reporting to me who every once in a while think that it's my job to make some sort of decision. They come to me and they say, what should we do? And I'm like, it's your call. In fact, when I interviewed at my current company, one of the questions I was asked as a director was, how do you make technical decisions? And I thought about it for a second and I said, I don't, that's your job. It also means that you have to be really clear about the difference between goals and implementation. You have to figure out what's important and what the actual intent is, rather than like how you might think that that goal might be accomplished. And lastly, you have to trust people, because here's the truth. There are a bunch of people reporting to me. I have 3 teams and a bunch of people in each of those teams. And I am actually accountable for every decision that's made by every one of those people. The easy thing to say is that I will trust their decisions as long as we don't disagree. The easy thing to say is if we disagree, they have a chance to prove to me that they're right. But that's not actually the sphere of autonomy. That's like, I'm open-minded and I'm willing to let you persuade me you're right. What's hard about this is actually trusting people whose decisions impact you to actually make the right decisions. And this, again, goes in both directions. I have to trust that my boss knows what she's doing within her own sphere of autonomy. I have to trust the people reporting to me that they know what they're doing. So as an example of this, I want to talk about 2 cases. Green is about stories here. So a while ago, I had an engineer who I was essentially promoting to a product owner. So she was going to be owning some sort of product that we were transitioning from another team to us. And I sat down with her and I said, I need you to basically do 2 things. I need you to deliver 1.0 of this in about a quarter, and I'd like you to basically make it so it's backwards compatible. There was a bunch of configuration that users had to write for this thing, and I didn't want them to have to rewrite all of that configuration from scratch. In my head, I actually had a really clear understanding of how I would go about implementing this. I had a really clear understanding of how I would implement this, by the way, because I wrote the first version of this that she was rewriting from scratch, which should tell you something about me as an engineer. And I didn't tell her all of that implementation detail because it wasn't all that relevant. So she went away, and every week or 2 I'd check in with her and I asked her if she wanted any help, and she didn't, and so I didn't pry. And about 2 months into this project, so about 2/3 into this project, she showed me what she had, and it turned out that she had done it in a completely different way than I expected. For one thing, it wasn't backwards compatible. But the thing is, I didn't actually want it to be backwards compatible. I said that, but I told her that I wanted it to be backwards compatible so people wouldn't have to rewrite all their configurations. She wrote a utility to convert the old style configurations to the new style configurations. The intent was satisfied. The other thing that happened was she ended up actually writing this as something that was UI driven, which I was completely not expecting, and was delightful. And it was an example for me of how every time I basically underspec how something should be done, there's an opportunity to be delighted by the fact that people who are far better than me aren't constrained by my vision of that. Another example of this, which ended up being more about people, was about 2 years later, I had a manager reporting to me who had an engineer under him who was suffering from some significant, persistent performance problems, enough so that in our environment we could have basically just fired that person. And I sat down with this manager. At this point I was more thoughtful about this kind of stuff, and I specifically and explicitly said, you have someone on your team who is a performance problem. We agree that they are a performance problem. In the next 2 months, I would like you to not have someone on your team who has a performance problem. I didn't specify implementation. In my head, by the way, it was very clear what should be happening here, right? Like we should just fire this person and move on. Because I didn't have some visibility that this manager had. What he knew that I didn't know was that there was some other team that I had no interactions with in the organization whose operational needs were actually a perfect fit for this engineer. So what he ended up doing was transferring this engineer to that other team. 2 years later, that engineer is still there and relatively successful, and that was a much, much better outcome. So, with me generally about why intent-based command is better? Fantastic. So, why are we talking about insubordination here? Well, it turns out that intent-based command is actually kind of hard. I found this quote that I love: mission-type tactics, command intent, mission-type tactics are advocated, but not always used by the chain of command in the United States, Canadian, Dutch, and British armies. I have snarkily turned this into something else, which is mission-type tactics are sometimes advocated, but rarely consistently used by corporate leadership. Because if I had a dime for every corporate leader I've ever heard say that they want to hire really smart people, perhaps even people smarter than them, to make localized, responsible decisions, but since they're accountable for those decisions, they have to approve them, I would have several dimes. So this model ends up basically breaking down, and I've seen 3 kinds of breakdowns that are worth addressing. The first one is actually accidental. It turns out that every single human being who works in your organization is a human being. This is a tautology. It's by definition true. And we all sort of think of ourselves just like as a human being, but as a function of the power distance between 2 people, the relationship ends up being kind of a lot less human. And what I've seen happen is that as I become a senior person in the organization, but in my head, like, I'm still Roy, I'm still the guy who, like, bakes cakes and is a human being. I just talk to people, and people don't think of me as Roy. People think of me as, this person who's been around for a while, or the director of data engineering. And so they tend to pay attention to what we say in a way that is completely not commensurate with the attention we are putting into whatever we're saying. And so we will say something offhand as just brainstorming, and people take this as some sort of gospel and run with it. I've talked to a CEO recently who said, I sometimes have a conversation with somebody in the hall, and 3 months later find out that somebody had launched a program to make it happen. I forgot about that. 2 examples of that. A while ago, I was newly responsible for the team that was going to identify my company's newest VPN product. And when I say VPN product, we thought we used the word product to mean anything. This is literally the VPN solution for internal employees to contact the mothership. So this has no actual product impact. And our CEO, who was 7 layers above, this was a 3,000 person company, had apparently said at some point that for our new VPN solution, we should use a given open source product. And so that came down the ranks. Each time it went down the ranks, it became a little more solidified and a little more like the word from above, literally, until the point where it got to my team. And they were trying to execute on that until I took over the team, and I talked to the manager responsible for that, and he said, this is a terrible idea, but we just kind of have to do it. And I went over to talk to my boss, and I said, listen, we're not going to do this thing because it's a terrible idea for these reasons. And he said, okay, but the CEO said we should do that. And I was like, well, cool. Our CEO knows where I sit, and if he wants to come down and have a conversation about this, I'm happy to listen to him. But until that happens, I own this, and I have to be responsible for this, and that's just not what we're going to do. And my boss at the time said, I don't want to be fired for this. And I said, well, being fired for this would be kind of stupid, but let's see what happens. So we did it the right way. I never heard from my CEO about this. I'm not actually surprised, because I really seriously doubt that he cared. This was just basically transmission problems. And I can sit here, I can stand here, and feel all proud that that happened to him. And the problem is that happened to me a month ago. I had been talking to my team about like the future of how we do some data warehouse stuff, and I talked about build versus buy, and I was just like talking, and I mentioned some product name, and 2 weeks later, the manager of the team in my one-on-one with him said, hey, listen, the team basically thinks that you have settled on this product, and then it's going to take a lot of effort to sort of like, get you to not pick this product. I want to be clear here. This product that he was mentioning, I've never talked to anybody in that company. I think I've seen their front page once. I don't know anything about it. I don't really care about it. But I was just talking, and that became law. So the other kind of failure is a little more serious, and that's basically an intentional boundary violation. This is where your boss basically tells you what to do. When I took over my team back in 2012, the day after I took over the team, my boss sat me down and said, Bob on your team is underperforming, you're going to have to fire him. And I was like, cool, tell me more. So Bob had some sort of pernicious performance problem, and so I was like, okay, I'll take a look at it. And I started talking to Bob and said, like, listen, we need to figure out whether or not it's going to work. And a week or two later, I sat down with my boss, who was like, why is Bob still here? And I said, because I'm trying to figure out what to do with Bob and what's going to happen to him. And he was like, well, I told you to fire him. And I was like, listen, I appreciate that, but you could have fired him any day until that last day before you gave me the team. Once you gave me the team, I own the team, and I own Bob, and I own his problems, and I own the resolution. So I kind of have to like figure this out for myself. And he was like, he hemmed and hawed, and we dealt with it. And it took me another 6 weeks or so to get to the point where I actually decided to fire Bob. That decision was right? Like he was right, but I didn't own it. And I had to own it before I executed it. The last interesting failure mode is a little more subtle. By the way, I'll throw a riddle out there and see if anybody figures it out. You can tell me after this. When is a sacred cow not a sacred cow? The answer is when it's a sacred cow. I just lost like 10% of the audience as they're trying to figure this out. So every organization has their own sort of like unstated expectations and best practices and just the way we do things here. And you don't have to do that. You can come up with other ways of doing things. That can create a more heterogeneous environment, which can be good. You can actually start testing out concepts and see which one works better, but it does mean that you become a little more of an irritant to the organization. Back at my last company, our approach to performance management was remarkably informal and undocumented by design. And at some point I decided that basically because people were sometimes kind of afraid of like not knowing where they stood, I would actually use this color coding system of where you stand. Like, here's what green means, here's what orange means, here's what red means. And I talked to my team about that. I wrote a document. I actually published it on the internet as part of my README. And my boss and HR at my company didn't particularly love it, but well, they let me run with it. It was a useful thing. Some other people in the company took it over. And that was a very sort of like lowercase I insubordination, which brings up the point that there's kind of a spectrum of insubordination, right? There's like going against unstated expectations, where you are just kind of a bit of a heretic, a kind of an irritant, something I have a lot of experience with. And all the way to the other side is when you're actually disobeying direct orders. It's worth being thoughtful at any given point about where on this spectrum you are. I will also tell you from personal experience that that point on the spectrum will actually change for you. I have basically throughout my entire life not been afraid of losing my job, except that on March 6, 2015, for 3 days, I was afraid of losing my job. On March 6, my kid was born, and I held him in my arms, and I can't exactly tell you what happened there, mostly because I wasn't even thinking, but I suddenly realized I was afraid of losing my job. Like, here's this like tiny little baby, and I'm suddenly responsible for him, and I'm gonna do whatever the hell it's gonna take to keep my job. Like that, my point on this spectrum like moved all the way over there. And after 3 days, thankfully that went away. And it's much better now. So that's insubordination. That's why insubordination is useful. I want to talk about doing insubordination really poorly, and I'm not going to talk about you doing insubordination really poorly. We've just met. That would be rude and presumptuous. I do want to talk about like all the different ways I've messed this up, and they really fall into only really two categories of kinds of failures. The first one is 2016 was a big year for me. You're going to see in a few moments. In 2016, I finally realized that throughout my adult life, I've never actually fully considered the people I reported to like human. Pretty much everybody who's ever worked for me will tell you that I am a kind, compassionate, thoughtful leader, as much as any Israeli can be. But all of the kindness and compassion and humanity that I've given people who reported to me, that I've given people that were my peers and partners in every organization, I completely withheld from people who were my managers and above. Because as far as I was concerned, they make more money than me, they have a higher title than me, I don't need to be nice to you, you basically have to take it. That doesn't result in building really great human relationships with the people that you theoretically are then going to, be insubordinate with. It also, frankly, doesn't result in treating people well. And I want to note, leaders are human as well. This is a kind of a personal presentation for me, more personal, I think, than I've ever done before, because I'm talking about some ways I've really screwed up. And the first time I'm doing that is right now. At some point, I think early February 2016, my boss and I had a one-on-one, and we sat down, and he said, "Hey, I was wondering if you had any feedback for me." And I thought about it for a moment, and I said, frankly, if it was up to me, I would fire you and replace you with 2 engineers. So I'm presenting in Israel. So here's the thing, right? I've told this story before. I actually mentioned this when I was interviewing at my current company to some people's sort of gasps. And some people, when they don't listen well, think this is admirable, think this is like something to respect because I was willing to give my boss direct constructive feedback, except that that's not what happened. Because frankly, if it was up to me, I would fire you and replace you with 2 engineers, is shitty feedback. It's not feedback, it's just mean. It's just me not actually talking to my boss as though he's a human being who deserves an ounce of humaneness. This was a guy I had worked with since basically the first day, like 7 years earlier that I had started this company. And in that one moment, like this was like a 1-minute interaction, I hurt his feelings deeply. And I hurt our relationship in a way that it recovered on a superficial level, but that guilt is still something I take with me. The other failure mode that I have was actually identified by literally my first manager. This was like in 1992. I was 21, I think. I had done something, and honestly, I can't even tell you what it was. It was a long time ago, before I think many of you may have been born. And it was something that basically caused me to be sort of like potentially a little closer to the firing line. And so she took me on a walk around the block, and she asked me, "Roy, do you have a professional death wish?" So, about that. I don't know if everybody here knows this, but I was born and raised in Israel. I was born in Tel Aviv, spent my first 7 years in Tel Aviv, then moved to Herzliya Pituach. We left when I was 14 to go to the US. And here are the people with whom I was raised, like the people to emulate the heroes of my childhood, growing up as a kid from like 1971 to 1985. Eliezer HaMaccabee was fighting some invading army, saw a war elephant that he thought had the commander of that army, dived under the elephant, speared it in the guts, killed the elephant, dropped down on him, he died. It's worth noting, by the way, that apparently this was a popular topic to paint during the Renaissance in Europe. The only problem is that many of the artists who were painting this from the Bible apparently had never seen an elephant before. So many of the paintings of this particular episode look absolutely ridiculous. For example, this thing, which looks more like an anteater. So that's him. When I was 13, our whole class, and at the time, I think it was basically around 13, every class, was taken up to this place. Anybody want to shout out what this is? So, the fortress stop of, Metzada, where a bunch of zealots, and to be clear, they're not actually zealots. The Sikarim thought the zealots were the collaborators, like these were the zealots of the zealots. They held up in Metzada for a few months, holding back the Roman army, and then the night before the Roman army was going to breach their walls, killed their entire families and themselves to avoid falling into slavery. Joseph Trumbledore fought in the Battle of Tel Hai, killed. When I was a kid, people were very fond of the apocryphal last thing that he said, which was, "Never mind, it's good to die for our country." Sarah Aronson, part of Neely, a group of Jews who spied for the British during World War I against the Turks. They were all trying to basically work with the British to bring the state of Israel into being sooner. She was caught and tortured and killed by the Turks. Hannah Senesh parachuted behind enemy lines in World War II as part of a British operation to try to save some Jews from Auschwitz. She was caught, she was tortured, she was killed. Netanyahu, the older one, I want to note, who led Operation Entebbe, and in this amazing operation was the single IDF casualty. So he was the leader of that operation and died. So every figure of note, every hero of my childhood was a martyr. And this is not normal. I know it's not normal because I asked. In preparation for this, I asked a bunch of my friends, randomly distributed throughout the world, what historical figures did you grow up with? And I then did some, analysis of how many of them were martyrs. In the US, there were basically none. It was Washington, Lincoln, who was murdered, but is famous not for being murdered, but rather for freeing the slaves and the Civil War. And a few other people like Michael Jordan, who's famous for, I think, being able to do something with a ball. I've generally found, I have this incredible bias that I think Canadians are the nicest people in the world. And this was to some degree confirmed because one of the figures that was mentioned by Canadians was Tommy Douglas, because he introduced universal health care in Canada. The two exceptions to this are India, where I had 100% martyrs, and Ireland, where I had 67% martyrs. It's worth noting that both of those countries, much like Israel, in their current independent state, did not exist prior to 1900. They were both occupied actually by Britain, which is another thing they potentially share with us. And the history of the creation of those countries, much like this country, is full of blood and suffering and sacrifice. So, when you ask me if I have a professional death wish, I kind of do. It's literally emotionally satisfying to me. And the way that ends up looking like is actually something that I found a little 30-second clip to demonstrate, because I love Samuel L. Jackson. Here's what I need you to imagine. I have discovered that there's a problem, and I am giving a rousing speech to my coworkers about what we should do about this. And my coworkers actually see me as somebody who's going to do something about this, because I am a leader. And the thing is that I am telling them what we're going to do, and I'm being listened to. And then I get eaten by a shark. And these are the faces of my coworkers. The truth is that the difference between effective insubordination and highly emotionally satisfying martyrdom has not always been entirely clear to me. This became very clear to me in 2016 Remember, big year? My boss sat down with me at some point and said, listen, you're kind of a pain in the ass, and you're kind of expensive to manage, and you kind of always fight all the things in kind of an annoying way, so I'm kind of thinking of firing you right now. And I was like, cool, cool. And we talked about it, and he basically gave me like 24 hours to figure out like what I wanted to do. Like, is this something I could change? And I had to think about it. And one of the reasons I had to think about it is because I suddenly was struck by the actual impact of being fired at that point. I've never actually cared about losing my job, except for those 3 days. But at this point, I was leading an organization of people who were actually pretty attached to me, and this was going to suck for them. So I had to figure out like what to do about this. And in order to do that, I suddenly basically realized that, there's a spectrum going from basically being overly principled to overly pragmatic. If you're overly principled, you're a zealot, you're a fanatic. And if you're overly pragmatic, you're amoral, you're a bit of a sociopath. You can guess where I've been on this spectrum. And the problem with being on the overly principled side of the spectrum is that there are some questions before you take on something like this that you either ask yourself or at least should ask yourself. The first question you should ask yourself is like, is this a battle worth fighting? Like, is this worth like doing something about? If it is, you should figure out whether or not you're the right person to do something about this. And if you are, you got to figure out like why you're doing this. So the problem is this: if you are overly principled, the way these questions end up working out is something like this. I have an ex-coworker who has told me that he had come to basically understand that as soon as I heard of something wrong, like an injustice, he could literally see a physical change in how I stood, because I was basically springing up for a physical response. Because if you're overly principled, the answer to, is this a battle worth fighting, is by definition automatically yes. And here's the other thing. If you're overly principled, and this is a battle worth fighting, the question of whether or not you're the person to fight this battle is moot. Of course you are. This, by the way, is Mila Jovovich playing Joan of Arc in the movie The Messenger. Joan of Arc was called by God to lead her people in a revolt against the British. There's no more "this is all on me" than that. The last thing is, if you're going to actually go to war, then if you're overly principled, you're mostly just doing it to make a point. You're doing it because you're standing up for what's right. And this is all basically stupid. So when I moved a little bit on that spectrum to the more pragmatic side, it meant that the answer to, is this a battle worth fighting, is maybe. And if it's a battle worth fighting, maybe I'm the right person to fight this battle. But here's the thing: if I am the right person to fight this battle, and I'm going to fight this battle, I'm going to fight it to win. And I'm going to fight it to win most efficiently, while inflicting essentially as little cost on the people with whom I'm dealing with here. That was a fundamental shift in how I viewed the world in 2016, and I can point to probably like 10 or more examples every year of battles that I've just walked away from because they evaluated to something other than yes and yes. And that said, I just want to be clear here, I still fail. Like 2 months ago, when I wasn't paying attention because I didn't feel like I was like working, because it was Saturday at 6:45 p.m. and I was with my family having some sort of like crappy dinner at an arcade, I got a Slack message from a coworker and I went to war in literally less than a minute. And then I figured out what I was doing and apologized, and it got better, and I'm still embarrassed by that. But, it gets better, but for me, I don't think this is ever going to be done. So, in case you only now started listening, a few words. The DRI model, directly responsible individual model, actually mostly lessens the need for insubordination if properly executed. Otherwise, insubordination can both give leaders actually more freedom to express themselves and participate in conversations and result in better outcomes. But also, if you're going to do something like this, make sure you're not doing it for effect or because it makes you feel good. Make sure you're doing it because you're actually partnering with the people around you to achieve the best possible impact. So, why am I having this conversation with you? I was once a partner in a small company, and when I say a small company, it was 3 people. It was me and my 2 best friends, who were also my upstairs neighbors. And it was very clear to us that this company was us. Like, whatever ailed this company, it was our job to make it better, and we were going to work well together. But companies get bigger. And as companies get bigger, people stop noticing and remembering that they are the company. There are undoubtedly people in this room who think that they work for Wix. The truth is that you are Wix, and you have a responsibility, if you want to be Wix rather than just paid by Wix, to care about this place and to do the right thing for this place, because you're not just like one of 2,000 people or one of 750 engineers. You are this company. I was looking at, when I was doing research for this, at some quotes about mission command. And I love this quote: "The concept of mission tactics made it the responsibility of each officer and NCO to do without question or doubt whatever the situation required as he or she personally saw it. Omission and inactivity were considered worse than a wrong choice of expedient. Even disobedience of orders was not inconsistent with this philosophy." Companies get bigger, and the sense of us, the sense of identity for the company, gets weaker. In some respects, you can say that if we don't do something against it, the identity of the company as a thriving group of humans dies. So I want to leave you with one quote from Dylan Thomas. He wrote this actually as a poem against dying. And it starts with, and I'll just leave you the first stanza: "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day, rage against the dying of the light." Go out there, make a difference, and be good at making that difference. And thanks for listening to me.